Have you ever wondered what it would be like to experience life through someone else's mind? Maybe a famous actor like John Malkovich.
Who the is John Malkovich?
It turns out there's an obscure late 90s film exploring this idea, creatively called Being John Malkovich. Our main character, Craig Schwartz, is a stereotypical failed artist. Even worse, a puppeteer. Depressed, broke, and emotionally distant from his wife Lottie. He gets a filing job on the 7th floor of Lester Corp and meets his new coworker and unreciprocating love interest, Maxine. He discovers a tiny hidden door, crawls inside with a piece of the door trim through the tunnel that follows, and gets sucked to the other side where he finds himself peering through the eyes of John Malkovich. 15 minutes later, he's spat out on the side of the highway covered in mud, and worst of all, he's lost his stick. Still, the experience has left him exuberant, so he tells Maxine, who suggests that they should start selling tickets to the mind of John Malkovich.
Sell tickets.
Lottie undergoes the experience, becoming enamored with the idea of being John Malkovich as she begins to undergo a gender identity crisis. Maxine, on the other hand, convinces Malkovich to have sex while Lottie is in him, and the two draw near. Craig, rejected now by his wife and coworker, locks up Lottie and enters Malkovich while Maxine believes Lottie is inside, allowing Craig to have sex with Maxine in Malkovich's body. Craig quickly discovers he can control Malkovich due to his puppeteering experience, an event which spooks Malkovich to the extent that he follows Maxine to the portal, whereupon John Malkovich enters John Malkovich. I'm not kidding you. Malkovich finds himself in himself. A special sort of hell that is. Well, just take a look. Anyway, back to reality, Malkovich is spat out on the side of the highway, demanding Craig to stop. He doesn't. Craig re-enters and continues to grow mastery over Malkovich to the point where he can control him permanently. Him and Maxine marry, and Craig launches his career into puppeteering. That's right, using Malkovich. Meanwhile, Lottie manages to escape with the help of her traumatized monkey and tracks down Lester, the owner of Lester Corp. It turns out that Dr. Lester also knows of the portal. Long story short, he had been using it to switch hosts consistently in order to allow himself to live forever, along with some friends of his. Lottie warns Lester of Craig, and the two plot to get him out of Malkovich. Maxine, who is resentful of her marriage to Craig and is finding out she made some very bad life decisions, works with Lottie to trick Craig out of Malkovich. They convince him Maxine has been kidnapped, and he must leave the body of Malkovich in order to save her. Craig, still worried about Maxine, gives up control and is spat out too, but finds that he was played for a fool. Poor Craig. Lester, at this moment, enters Malkovich, and the transition is complete. However, Craig is not finished. He returns to the portal, but the host has switched. 7 years later, we find Craig stuck as an observer, watching Lottie and Maxine happily together. Craig is in the mind of Emily, the daughter of Maxine and Lottie, forever trapped as a prisoner.
The film provokes a very Cartesian theory of the self in that the body is a physical vessel that the mind occupies for a period of time, but the mind itself is an immaterial, non-physical substance. Now, this idea is further supported by the fact that the film doesn't tell us what happens to the bodies of the people who are in Malkovich's mind. The bodies seem to not exist for 15 minutes and then come back into existence on the side of the highway. The film puts a very artistic spin on Descartes' notion of dualism so that a single body can be occupied by multiple minds or selves. Craig's mind is able to coexist with John Malkovich's mind in a single body. So the body and mind are not just separable and independent entities, but are also compositional and interchangeable. In contrast with Descartes' notion of mind-body dualism, we find out that Lester actually has a lot of knowledge and experience with the portal and its capabilities. So much so that Lester has reduced the phenomenon down to a science. He is able to utilize the portal as a mechanism to transfer consciousness from one body to another, continuously as a means of preserving his own mind or self. Lester's ability to reduce the phenomena down to a utility nudges the viewer towards a materialistic view because mechanisms are usually thought of as things that act in a physical system. However, when we look closely at Lester's character, we see that he exemplifies the exact opposite view. Lester loves his mental existence to the extent that he will transfer it from one body to another to preserve it. So he consequently defeats the idea that the mind is generated by the material structures of the brain because his existence continues through the occupation of multiple brains. The concept of free will is interesting in the film because we start with the assumption that each individual entity is acting freely in accordance with their own will. Then Craig imposes his will through Malkovich's body, and at that point we can confidently state that Malkovich's body is no longer acting in accordance with Malkovich's mind. So we should be inclined to think that Craig is hindering John's freedom of will. However, upon Malkovich discovering that an entity other than his own is influencing the direction of his physical fate, we see what is like a mental battle of Malkovich trying to maintain sole control. Now this demonstrates the immaterial quality of one's mind and consequently one's freedom of will as a product of the mind. An analogy would be like if Malkovich has been driving one vehicle by himself all his life, then seemingly out of nowhere, Craig nudges the steering wheel from the back seat. Slowly but surely, Craig finds a way to get himself into the driver's seat and put Malkovich into the back seat. Malkovich may certainly have an opinion on where the car should be driven, but he can't reach the steering wheel. It's not that Malkovich loses his capacity for freedom, but rather he loses his ability to express his will in the physical world. We don't get to find out what happens to Malkovich's mind when Craig's mind takes full control over the body. It is suggested that Malkovich's mind gets pushed into the material brain's subconscious, thus forfeiting its control. Therefore, the will may still exist as a product of the immaterial mind's existence, but is no longer in a position to interact with the material world.
Being John Malkovich represents a fantastic mixture between philosophy and film. It explores highly abstract ideas such as philosophy of mind and free will, and presents them in a way in which anyone can relate and approach them. The philosophy draws on a number of others, such as Descartes and his mind-body dualism, yet offers an alternative account as well. Nowhere do we see the mind existing entirely independent of a body as Descartes would, but instead it must inhabit a sort of body to exist in any form. Secondly, it rejects the traditional notion of mind superiority. Instead, it sees the material world as superior. Lester, Craig, and Lottie all seek out Malkovich to make some sort of material gain. In regards to free will, the film seems to fit a libertarian view, wherein free will is grounded in an immaterial mind, and thus is not determined in the same way as everything else is. The mind thus becomes the locus of the will, and allows individuals to freely act. Overall, Being John Malkovich offers a rich amount of philosophy, coupled with an excellent film that can reach a large audience which traditionally would miss out on these usually dense philosophical issues.